contribution to the Mississaugas of New Credit, and by recognizing the history and contributions of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Our shared history begins around 400 years ago. When Europeans first arrived, the generous partnership of Indigenous peoples helped them to establish profitable enterprises and settlements. In 1763, the Royal Proclamation confirmed the original occupancy of Indigenous peoples and paved the way for nation-to-nation treaties between the British Crown and Indigenous peoples. Treaties were negotiated and signed with the intent of delivering mutual benefits. In Ontario, most of this happened hundreds of years ago. To some, 7 generations ago can seem disconnected. But we know that our history is always shaping our present. And for some of us, treaties are part of the history that shapes our prosperity. Treaties granted us land to live on and water to drink. They're the foundation on which the short history of our country has carried forward, a history in which every generation has built a better life by building on the achievements of the past. But that is only one side of our story. For Indigenous people in Ontario, this same history created a very different reality. Despite the promise of early treaties and the respectful nation-to-nation partnerships they established, Indigenous people became the target of colonial policies designed to exploit, to assimilate, and to eradicate them. Based on racism, violence, and deceit, these policies were devastatingly effective. They disempowered individuals and disenfranchised entire communities. When Canada became a country 149 years ago, the legacy of violent colonialism only gathered momentum. From coast to coast to coast, the residential school system set out to, and I quote, take the Indian out of the child by removing Indigenous children from their homes and systematically stripping them of their languages, cultures, laws, and rights. Children were physically, emotionally, and sexually abused, and many died. These heartbreaking stories are hard to hear. For generations of Indigenous people, these stories were their lives. Les récits des survivants des survivants.
These stories are breaking our hearts, and it is very difficult to hear them. However, we must listen to them.
Schools are closed, but they have been closed for not even one generation. Echoes of their racist colonial attitudes can still be heard. And the echoes of a society-wide intergenerational effort of cultural genocide continues to reverberate loudly and painfully in the lives of Indigenous people today. However we choose to measure a person's opportunity and security in life, a disturbing gap exists between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous population. It is the gap created by a country that abused and betrayed its Indigenous people. It is a gap that swallows lives and extinguishes hope across generations. For a long time, Indigenous people's calls for justice could not be heard across this yawning gulf because Canada did not want to hear them. It is thanks to the resiliency of those who endured the abuses of the past that we are finally listening. Thank you for finding the strength and courage to come forward and tell your stories and the stories of those who were lost. In opening our eyes, you have given us this chance to move forward as partners and the opportunity to say we are sorry. So, before I go on, I want to show my respect for all the survivors and all the victims by offering a formal apology for the abuses of the past. As Premier, I apologize for the policies and practices supported by the past Ontario governments and for the harm that they caused. I apologize for the province's silence in the face of deaths and abuses at residential schools. And I apologize for the fact that the residential schools are only one example of systematic, intergenerational injustices inflicted upon Indigenous communities across Canada. By adopting policies designed to eradicate your cultures and extinguish your rightful claims, previous generations set in motion a force so destructive that its impact continues to reverberate in our time. And so I want to apologize for all of this by saying I am sorry for the continued harm that generations of abuse is causing to Indigenous communities, families, and individuals. A título de pandemia.
As cleaner, I want to apologize for everything that happened in the past and the suffering that it keeps bringing into your lives.
Nor can the act of apology alone change the future. In making this apology, as in making the political report last summer, I hope to demonstrate our government's commitment to changing the future by building relationships based on trust, respect, and Indigenous peoples' inherent right to self-government. This act of apology is not the end, nor is it the beginning. It is but one step on the journey to reconciliation and healing that we are committed to walking together. Last year at this time, we took one of those steps when Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission held its closing ceremonies in Ottawa. I was honored to participate in the Walk for Reconciliation, and I want to thank Justice and now Senator Murray Sinclair, the Commission, and all the survivors who participated for helping to illuminate a dark past, for honoring all those who lost their lives, and for pointing the way forward. Ontario has already taken first steps on this journey forward. They're highlighted in The Journey Together, which is a report that we're releasing today. It outlines how Ontario is further responding to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's findings and calls to action. Today, Ontario commits to working in partnership with Indigenous leaders and their communities to undertake 26 new initiatives that will help build trust and respect into our relationships and build opportunity and security into the lives of Indigenous people. These next steps begin, as I have today, with efforts to help everyone in our province understand the truth about our history. We will educate all Ontarians about the horrors of the residential school system, the betrayals of past governments, and our rights and responsibilities as treaty people, because in Ontario, we are all treaty people. Through the work we are doing in our education curriculum, teach everything about Ontario, the truth about past, and what it means for all of us today. In addition to further actions to commemorate victims and educate Ontarians, Minister David Zimmer intends to introduce legislation today that would declare the first week of November as Treaties Recognition Week. The Journey Together also introduces and enhances programs focused on closing opportunity gaps and ending intergenerational cycles of trauma. It guides our actions to enhance Indigenous voices in the administration of justice and build a justice system that is responsive to Indigenous legal principles, autonomy, and cultures. And because Indigenous languages and cultures are critical to the well-being of communities and to reconciliation itself, we will take a number of actions to support Indigenous communities in protecting and promoting traditional knowledge, languages, and oral histories. Finally, we will rename the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. The commitments Ontario is making in the Journey Together are supported with an investment of more than $250 million over the next 3 years. But funding commitments alone cannot undo generations of racism and abuse. To do that, we truly need to learn from our past, which is why our programs and actions will be developed and evaluated in close partnership with our Indigenous communities, openly and respectfully. We are also working to incorporate Indigenous elder and youth perspectives into decision-making across government, because reconciliation cannot be compartmentalized. It is a society and a government-wide journey. And so we will also work closely with Canada's federal government to commit to reconciliation are encouraging and vital to our success. We understand that there will be setbacks as we walk this road, as we unlearn the patterns of previous generations and replace them with new, healthy relationships. But setbacks will not weaken our resolve to walk together to a place of trust, accommodation, and friendship. We do not approach reconciliation as something we need to get over with. We approach it as something that we need to get right. Mr. Speaker, Indigenous partners, my fellow Ontarians, there is no more denying our past or hiding from the truth. The duty owed to Indigenous peoples is enshrined in our laws and in our values as Canadians. Building trust, respectful relationships with Indigenous people, and taking steps to end intergenerational cycles of trauma and inequality, that is our present task. One day, it will be our history. With the steps we're taking together to build a country that lives up to its laws, its values, and its reputation as a force for good in the world, we're walking a path that connects us across generations. We're undoing the harm caused by our past and building a society where future generations of Indigenous and non-Indigenous can walk together as equals, living in peace and harmony on the land that we now share. Walking this journey together, we will not fail. Chimiwech, Miawen, Napoli.
Thank you. I would now like to ask the Leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition to bring his remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and good morning. As Leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition, on behalf of the entire Ontario PC caucus, I am honored to receive the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on this very special day here on the floor of the Ontario Legislature. Today, it is truly an honor to share this floor with our elected colleagues, elders, and special guests. If I could acknowledge, as the Premier has, Isidore Day, the Ontario Regional Chiefs of Ontario, Margaret Froh, the President of the Métis Nation of Ontario, Nathan Obed, the President of the Inuit Taperet Kanatami, Dr. Dawn Laval-Havard, President of Ontario Native Women's Association, Sheila McMahon, President of Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centres, Andrew Wesley, a residential school survivor, Verna Porter-Burnell, Métis Senator. With official release of the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission nearly a year ago today, I can still remember the emotional response that I had when reading the findings for the very first time. The Indian residential school system is a tragic chapter in our history and has resulted in lasting and profound impacts on our Indigenous communities to this day. As you know, over 6,750 individual and residential school survivors contributed to the Commission during the 7-year process that began in 2008. This includes the combined and unique experiences of our First Nations, Métis and Inuit peoples. I'd like to personally thank each of these survivors for going through the difficult and emotional task of applying their own experiences with the residential school system in Canada for the benefit of future generations. Cela inclut l'expérience combinée.
This includes the experience of Inuits and of different Aboriginal people. I would like to thank them in this very difficult task that they had to remember their hard experience in this system of schools.
And I thank them for their extraordinary courage to speak. Anybody who takes the time to read Survivor's Sleep component in the final report can't help but be profoundly moved. The numbers are staggering. Over 150,000 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis youth were part of the residential school system. Torn from their homes, they were forced to assimilate to a culture not their own. At these schools, children were subject to physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. 1 out of every 25 of these children died there. Some were buried in unmarked graves, their parents and families not notified. It stands in stark contrast to Ontario and the Canada that we know and celebrate today, and the education system that many take pride in. I was proud to be in the House of Commons when the Government of Canada made its historic apology. Unfortunately, for many, that apology came far too late. I'm proud that in Canada, treaty rights are enshrined in the federal Constitution. And I was encouraged last year when the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was released, that the Prime Minister apologized once again on behalf of the Government of Canada and asked forgiveness of the Aboriginal people of this country for failing them so profoundly. This burden is ours as a country and a province. We are sorry. Nous sommes désolés. It is critical to remember we are sorry on us. I look forward to working toward the 94 calls to action as a parliamentarian, an Ontarian, and a Canadian, and towards bringing truth and reconciliation between our nations. As a province, our commitment is to live and work together with our First Nations, Métis and Inuit partners to ensure the principles of trust, mutual respect, and shared benefits. We are committed to supporting survivors and to continue to strengthen relations with our Aboriginal partners. As the official opposition, we will continue to work hard to ensure the Government of Ontario will continue to work towards this goal and to ensure the necessary supports are being provided to our Aboriginal communities. We look forward to reaching across the aisle and working not only with our counterparts but also directly in partnership with Indigenous communities. Because all apologies, all statements, all recommendations, all ceremonies are empty and inconsequential gestures without concrete and meaningful action. Now more than ever, it is time for us to come together as a province to work hard on behalf of all Ontarians. And that begins by recognizing the mistakes that were made in the past. For their hard work and perseverance, I would like to thank the Chair of the Commission, Justice Murray Sinclair, as well as Commissioners Mary Wilson and Wilton Littlechild, along with all those who previously served on the Commission for their immense contributions which led us to this day. Thank you again for all our special guests who have joined us this morning. Thank you, merci, and may gwech.
Thank you. I would now like to invite the leader of the third party to bring her remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Elders Dumont and Charles, Regional Chief Day, President Fro, President Obed, President McMahon, President Dr. Lavelle, Harvard, Reverend Wesley, and all of the Indigenous leaders and youth and residential school survivors that have joined us here today. Thank you for being here. With which I want to thank all of the elders, chiefs, and guests who are here today in this house on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. There was a time when this house, this province, and its institutions were not just complicit, but part of authorizing and allowing the most egregious and harmful policies towards First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. For years, governments in this province and in this country did everything they could to ignore and violate the human rights and treaty rights of Indigenous peoples, to eliminate cultural practices, eliminate Aboriginal governments, replacing existing forms of Aboriginal government and in the process disempowering Aboriginal women who held significant, powerful roles in many First Nations, destroy Indigenous communities, and destroy families. Canada engaged in cultural genocide. As the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Justice Mary Sinclair writes in the Commission's final report, residential schools are one of the darkest, most troubling chapters in our nation's history. They targeted the most vulnerable people, children. They tried to break the spirit of Indigenous peoples. And as Justice Sinclair says, quote, that any Indigenous person survived the culturally crushing experience of the schools is a testament to their resilience and to the determination of those members of their families and communities who struggled to maintain and pass on to them what remained of their diminishing language and traditions. It is a testament to survivors like Reverend Wesley and to the strength of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples across Canada. And this recognition today in this House is long overdue. There are two pieces to the Commission's work: truth and reconciliation. And today, we can learn the truth. It is written in the volumes of the Commission's report. We can read and learn and begin to try to understand the real foundations on which this country and this province was built. We can learn the truth, that child neglect and abuse was at the core of the residential school system. We can learn the truth that the government failed to provide the funding, the food, the medical treatment, the proper housing, the duty of care that we owe to every child. We can learn the truth and recognize that the legacy of the residential school system is its intergenerational impact on current and future First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. La vérité, nous pouvons,
The truth that we can learn.
the hearings may be over, the report may have been written, today's responses may have been delivered, but the listening cannot stop, because the work of reconciliation, the work that we must do, is only just beginning. Of course, it's true that some progress has been made, like the work that's been done to ensure that this history is part of our curriculum. That's important. But the Commission's findings demonstrate the ongoing failure right here in Ontario to live up to our responsibilities. For too many people in this province, racism and systemic discrimination continues to shape their lives, the conditions in which they live, and the doors that are open to them. Neglect, mistreatment, and abuse have been part of the lives of so many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people and women, and a national inquiry into the murdered and missing Indigenous women is long overdue. Far too many First Nations communities continue to live without clean, safe drinking water in our province. Today, there are at least 133 drinking water advisories in effect in First Nations communities across Canada, and 90 of those drinking water advisories are for First Nations communities right here in Ontario, from Madawapiskat to Curve Lake to Panjicum and Shoal Lake border. In this province, children are growing up without safe, clean drinking water. Parents are trying to feed their families without safe, clean drinking water. Elders are living without safe, clean drinking water, and that's unacceptable. It is unacceptable that any family is forced to live without decent housing. And it is unacceptable that so many First Nations communities do not have access to the health care that people need. In this province today, there is a state of health emergency in many First Nations communities. A health emergency born of decades of discrimination and neglect, but born out in extreme health inequities and suffering. A severe shortage of physicians and healthcare providers and medical equipment in First Nations communities. And lives that are being cut short by diseases like rheumatic fever, diabetes, and hepatitis C. This is not what should be happening to anyone in Ontario today. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report is not just a series of volumes to be read. Son rapport est un appel à l'action.
This report is a call to action.
Or calls to action. And it is incumbent upon the government and upon all of us to act on those recommendations. And they must compel us to move forward on the long journey towards meaningful reconciliation, to build a stronger relationship as equals between the Government of Ontario and First Nations, Métis, and Inuit governments and peoples, to remember the past and to change the future. And most importantly, acting on the 94 calls to action means acting with much greater urgency and much greater resolve to address the ongoing impact of racism and discrimination and injustice against Indigenous peoples in every form it takes. Frankly, we can no longer allow jurisdictional disputes between the Government of Ontario and the Government of Canada to serve as an excuse for inaction in the face of the violation of people's rights. So today, on behalf of Ontario's New Democrats, I want to take a moment to express our full support for the apology that has been issued by the Government of Ontario, by the Premier this morning. It is an important and long overdue apology, but it alone is not enough. And I know that she acknowledged that by some of the other commitments that were made along with that apology. We'll be doing our job to make sure that those commitments are adhered to. We must all show, all of us, show the political will and the determination that exists today to solve the problems that communities face, to ensure that everyone in this province has safe drinking water and safe housing, to clean up lands and rivers that are contaminated with toxins, like the Wabigoon River, that is central to the way of life for the Grassy Narrows First Nation, which we know can be done as long as the political will is there. To ensure that women and children and men can all live free of violence. To ensure that every family has access to the health care that they need in their communities, and to ensure that children and youth have access to the opportunities that they need to start their lives and look forward to their own futures. We owe it to every family that was torn apart. We owe it to every victim and every survivor. And we owe it to the future generations to do everything we can to build a future free of racism, discrimination, inequity, and injustice. That is our task moving forward. If we accomplish it over the years, we will have achieved reconciliation. It'll be a long, difficult journey, but we will take it together. Miigwech, merci beaucoup. Thank you all very much for being here on this historic day.